Well, good morning and welcome to another edition of Elevenses. It's Wednesday, isn't it? 16th of September. We're well into autumn now, but we're having some lovely weather at the moment out there. I was out training yesterday and it got distinctly hot by 12 o'clock. So what have we got for you in the show today? Fair amount to get through. We have an item on Charlie and Ewan doing the long way up on Harley Livewires. We'll be looking at the new strategy for starting the smart motorway conversions. Motorway speed limit is being reduced on some stretches by Highways England. And yet another smart helmet has appeared, this one from Australia, and it looks a little bit more interesting than most of the ones I've seen. So don't forget, if you have anything you want to say about the show, do add your question or a comment or feedback or anything you want to say, basically, and I will get back to you at the end of the show. Okay, so let's crack on. I'll be starting by blowing my own trumpet a little bit this morning. As you may know, as well as switching to online briefings and debriefings, I've also launched online coaching sessions this year. Now, this is all response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but in other ways, I think it's long overdue. Here's what Patricia had to say a few weeks back about her course. She said, having just had a debrief via Zoom, I can safely say I was much more in a state of mind to take in information and comments than after the actual ride. Besides, during a debrief, you can sit with a cup of coffee, no distractions except cats, of course, take notes, go through video footage in detail on large screen, etc. Also, as debriefs are scheduled to everyone's convenience, you can choose a time to suit. I have just finished the excellent Ben's course and have learned shed loads, not just from the ride, but also from the follow-up. Yes, she says, the chit-chat is a bit lacking. We're not being face-to-face, but that's not what it's about. And she continues, I can highly recommend this way of teaching. And as a former ROSPA candidate, I can now say I have been given more material to work with on the road in this course than has been practically useful than I have ever had before. And she says she, for one, is quite happy. So that's great feedback. It's a funny thing, actually. Motorcyclists often want the very latest in motorcycle technology and rider safety. We're all dashing out to the shops to buy the latest in thing. Traction control, riding modes, airbag jackets seem to be the latest hot seller. But we can be really, really reluctant to embrace new ideas when it comes to rider training, which is, I think, is rather odd. And it doesn't matter whether that's in terms of the course content or how that course is actually delivered. But I honestly think that the same old just isn't good enough. Now, survival skills has never stood still. It's been 20 years since I've been running these courses, but I've always added new material to the course, and I've always been an early adopter of technology. I had radios and on-bike video footage before anybody else really ever used it. I used to use a little PDA to play back video footage. I caught on one of the very first cameras which recorded to an SD card. That was 20 plus years ago, even before YouTube appeared. So I always looked to see how I could improve my training, even if it's in ways that aren't the normal method. So I think what's obvious is that the coronavirus problem is not going away anytime soon. And so new solutions to training are required, and it makes a lot of sense to switch to Zoom for many of these courses. But I know that people are still having a real issue accepting that video calls can be effectively used for training purposes. I had somebody turn down a course just the other week for that reason. So here's some feedback from Julie, who booked an online coaching session. So no practical training on this course, just online coaching. And she says, excellent training. I booked an online course as a gift to help gain confidence with a new bike following a crash. And she said, although it was a new way of doing things and evidently more tricky in some places to describe what you would otherwise be experiencing on a roads-based practical course, the online teaching was first class and completely relatable. Kevin taught what to do when things go wrong, how to swerve, how to correct lines, how to avoid running tight or wide, but also why they were happening in the first place. such as asking the bike to do two things at once. Braking and steering is what she's talking about there, or gripping too tightly. So that's all about posture. She said that we covered basics that were taught as part of her Mod 1, but at the time that nobody explained why they were needed, just that you had to use them to pass, as well as lots of other tricks and tips that ultimately turned nerves into a big wide grin in a matter of hours. I look forward to booking more courses, highly recommended. So online coaching really, really does work, and if that's attracts your attention, do drop me a line. Right, okay. If you've been feeling that Charlie and Ewan have been absent from the screens for too long, their new series, Long Way Up, begins on Apple TV on the 18th of September. The series was filmed as they rode from the tip of South America to Los Angeles between September and December last year. They undertook the journey on Harley Davidson's Livewire electric motorcycle. Now, at the time the show was shot, the bikes actually weren't in the showroom. And in film news, Ewan McGregor says that there were times when they couldn't actually find anywhere to plug in their hybrid, their electric bikes. He says, we had a lot to learn. Occasionally we will plug in at people's houses or a hostel or bar or a restaurant. We just asked people if they minded, and we plugged in our bikes, and across the board, everybody was happy to do it. But he does go on to say that occasionally they would get stuck, and then we had to find a generator. That was pretty daunting through Patagonia and the Atacama Desert in Chile. The article also mentions that they had bike trouble without mentioning any details. So it'll be interesting to see how they coped with electric motorcycles on a pretty arduous journey. Although I'll wait to see it myself until it appears on a more accessible channel. So that's Charlie and Ewan and their Long Way Up series, which starts on Friday on Apple Plus TV. Don't forget, you are watching Kevin Williams here, Survival Skills, with my 11s show. I'm back on Wednesdays and Sundays at 11, so do tune in. Next piece of news, I've got both concerns what's going on with the roads. Now, Highways England have confirmed that a number of proposals to restart the conversion of ordinary motorways into smart motorways is a commitment to safety on those roads, and the plans come as a part of the organisation's annual report. Now, if you recall the timeline, what happened was back in October 2019, there were concerns that the accident rate on smart motorways was higher than equivalent non-smart motorways, the unconverted ones. And the Secretary of State for Transport, who is Grant Shapps, asked the Department for Transport to undertake a stock take of the safety of smart motorways. Now, this smart motorway stocktake came out in March, just in time for the pandemic, so it kind of got a bit overlooked. But they established in this action plan that in most ways, and I emphasize most ways, smart motorways are at least as safe as or safer than the conventional motorways replaced. And they go on to say that, however, there are individual risks within their operation that could be further reduced to improve safety and public confidence. And they conclude, we're determined to do all we can to make our roads as safe as possible. We'll take forward the measures set up by the DFT. And that involves, as I said, an 18-point action plan. And they want to strengthen existing communications and public awareness messages aimed at understanding how smart motorways should be used and what to do in emergency. The changes include an investment of an extra £5 million to achieve that. There will be an end to the use of dynamic hard shoulder running. In other words, they won't have these lanes which switch between an ordinary hard shoulder and a running lane. It will basically be converted to a full-time running lane, and that should end some driver confusion. They will also roll out more quickly the stopped vehicle detection system, which it currently is missing from a lot of these smart motorways. And what they aim to do is have a system in place that will detect most stopped vehicles within 20 seconds. And that will be standard on new schemes. Okay, so the organisation is also committed to a new standard for spacing of the refuges, a maximum of 1 mile apart, and they will look, it says, where feasible, to provide them every 0.75 of a mile. So they say that motorists should typically be able to reach one in 45 seconds at 60 miles per hour. So what did I think about that? Well, basically, in most ways, smart motorways are at least as safe as or safer than the conventional motorways they replaced. Right, so in other words, they are only safer in a few places. At least as safe as isn't a safety improvement, is it? And the implication of the phrase "in most ways" is that in some ways they must be therefore less safe. But again, what we don't know is how much and in which ways, because that is simply glossed over whilst they list 18 ameliorative measures. I still personally think there are all sorts of issues with smart motorways which we really need to get sorted out. Here's one. The organisation is committed to a new standard for spacing emergent places to stop an emergency, a maximum of 1 mile apart, and where feasible, 0.75, etc., etc. Okay, the idea that you can reach one in 45 seconds at 60 miles per hour sounds great on paper, but what happens if you come to a sudden screeching halt? And it happens. I've had a rod thrown through the cases of a car engine after a big bolt went through the radiator. I was still trying to figure out why the radiator, the heating had gone off before I realised that the vehicle was overheating. And literally, as I started to pull off towards the hard shoulder, the engine seized solid. There was no way that I could have coasted 3/4 of a mile at that point. The car just, literally almost stopped dead, even though I dipped the clutch. And it says nothing about remedial work being carried out on the hundreds of miles of smart motorway already in place, which have much longer gaps in some places between the refuges. If you recall, the original pilot scheme was around Birmingham and the refuges were much closer together. Now, one of my regular critics on this issue says, he keeps pointing out that we're quite happy to use dual carriageways with no hard shoulder, and he states there's no evidence that suggests that they're particularly dangerous. But that argument ignores some very, very simple maths. Let's assume for a moment that the breakdown rate for all vehicles is identical, whether they're on a dual carriageway or motorways. And I don't actually believe that's true, actually, but let's just assume that for a moment. And let's assume that all vehicles that break down actually come to a halt on the carriageway itself. And let's also assume that the flow rate of vehicles in each lane is exactly the same. Therefore, if there are more lanes, there is more traffic flowing, and there is a greater likelihood within that traffic flow that per mile some vehicles will break down. And in fact, the maths is pretty damn straightforward. If there are 4 lanes rather than 2, there will be twice as many broken down vehicles on any particular stretch of road on a 4-lane smart motorway than there will be on a 2-lane dual carriageway. So the maths is straightforward, but I also a feeling that the motorway journeys tend to be more arduous for the vehicle itself. People tend to do higher speeds for longer distances, and I suspect that shows up weaknesses in the vehicles themselves. Vehicles that might not break down on a shorter dual carriageway journey may well break down on a longer motorway journey. Now, just as a count on this, I was watching the number of broken down vehicles as I drove back from Exeter to the A40 via, obviously, the motorway system back in July, at the end of July. It was just about the time that a lot of people were taking a holiday after lockdown, and I passed 10 broken down vehicles, which is roughly 1 every 20 minutes. Now, fortunately, each of those vehicles was actually off the road on the hard shoulder. There were none on the smart section of the M3, which is a stroke of luck. So it'd be interesting to know what the breakdown rate actually is across the 2 roads. I suspect it's much higher for motorways than it is for dual carriageways, and that would explain the advice given to drivers about checking their vehicle before setting off on long journeys on motorways by the AA, the RAC, and even Highways England. I also suspect that the dynamics of a breaking down vehicle on a busy 2-lane dual carriageway is very different from that on a busy 4-lane stretch of smart motorway. If you think about it, when there are only 2 lanes, if a vehicle breaks down in the slow lane, as it slows down, everything behind it has to slow down too, simply because you're trying to squeeze 2 lanes into 1. So the bunching up effect is more dramatic. By contrast, if a vehicle breaks down on a 4-lane stretch of motorway, there are still 3 lanes to take up the traffic. And what that means is that the vehicles can usually move out into the next lane out and keep moving at speed. And the result is, of course, that for vehicles at the back of this, ever approaching queue, there's no obvious reduction in the flow rate to warn drivers and obstructions. And then what happens is you get the problem that wrote off one of a car that I was driving some years ago. I broke down on a dual carriageway. I did everything I could to get the car off the road. I got about 3/4 of it out of the carriageway, so there was only probably 2 feet of car actually in the road itself, in the lane. The rest of it was actually off the side of the road. And I was still hit from behind. And what happened, I'm pretty sure, was that the vehicle behind me when I had to stop was a lorry, an HGV. It pulled out to pass, and the car behind it didn't see my stopped vehicle until too late. Basically, as the HGV moved out, it uncloaked my parked vehicle, and the driver just smashed into it. Now, I'm pretty damn sure that a lot of the crashes that have happened on smart motorways are exactly this kind of accident, where one vehicle moves out at the very last second and leaves the car behind nowhere to go. Now, you can argue that people should be following at a distance that allows them to stop in the distance they can be clear, blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, the fact is that motorways often run at capacities which make that impossible. So, I think there's still a lot of questions to be answered about smart motorways, and I don't see them being answered by this report. Okay, so just remind you, set a reminder to come back to 11's every Wednesday and Sunday at 11. You can catch up over on YouTube at my Survival Skills UK channel. Next item, yes, Highways England has also announced that there'll be a speed limit cut from 70 to 60 on parts of 4 motorways in a trial. Now, this is to reduce pollution, and it'll happen before October, says the press release, which basically means as it's now mid-September, it'll happen within the next fortnight. The stretches of motorway chosen, which are the M6 junction 6 to 7 by Witton, the M1 junction 33 to 34 by Rotherham, the M602 junction 1 to 3 near Eccles, and the M5 junctions 1 to 2 near Oldbury. They're all affected by higher levels of nitrogen dioxide. Now, nitrogen dioxide is one of the tailpipe emissions, and the BBC item which I read, which is presumably drawn from the Highways England press release, states correctly that NO2 is a serious air pollutant, and that's because it's highly toxic. I'm not quite so sure about the statement that says it indirectly contributes to the warming of the planet. I need to check my long-distant memories of an environmental chemistry course at college, but as far as I remember, it's N2O, or nitrous oxide. That's the greenhouse gas, and that's why we have catalytic converters which actually convert N2O to NO2 in the first place. The impact of the 60 limit will be reviewed in a year's time. Iwan Lefebvre, who's the head of environment at Highways England, says ultimately the air quality challenge will be solved at the tailpipe by vehicle manufacturers and changes in vehicle use. But until that happens, they will continue their extensive program of pioneering research and solutions. Okay, and just a quick update on last-minute training availability. I've got Friday and Sunday free this week. I've just had a cancellation, or rather a postponement of Sunday. Weather looks reasonable. Got more dates available the following week, and the weather is still looking reasonably fine. So if you do fancy a course, you can check out my training locations anywhere around the M25, Herts, Bucks, Essex and Surrey, and I do have also locations from northwest and southeast London too. Okay, so final item, another month, another smart helmet. Over the last several years, I've seen a whole bunch of helmets that try to incorporate some kind of heads-up display for the rider. The argument is usually that by using a heads-up display which is in the helmet, you don't have to take your eyes off the road. But in fact, the opposite is actually true. Even with a heads-up display, we have to move our eyes to focus on the information, and we lose the view of the road ahead while we're doing that. We can only see a tiny amount of the information that's around us at any moment, thanks to the way our eyes work. So just putting a heads-up display doesn't actually do the job much better than simply looking down at a display would do. All it really avoids is having to move your head to look down at the instruments or across to the mirrors. It still requires that change of visual focus. And anyway, half the time, the information being shown is stuff that I would argue isn't actually necessary. Incoming calls, controlling media, that kind of thing really isn't actually a priority. But I was quite interested to see that this helmet, called the Foresight Mark I, takes a rather different route. And if you cut through all the marketing gabble about empowerment and the need for heightened awareness and improved safety, what you'll find is a novel way of transmitting information to the rider. Alfred Boyardis, the co-founder and CEO of Foresight Helmet, says the key feature that sets it apart from other helmets is a special light display that can tell you future alerts through the app. The Australian startup was previously a James Dyson Award winner for this novel system, and it's called Radar, and it's patented. And basically, what it is uses is a series of LEDs around the visor, which are coloured, and they provide you with the information in a minimalist way. So, the idea is that we're already using our visual system to scan the environment, but we can feed lights into that without disrupting our attention on the view ahead. And the idea is that the colors of the LEDs will relate to what's happening on the road ahead. So a green blink in the visor means you're coming up on a left or right turn in your navigation system, and this blink will wind down to the side at which your next turn is on. An orange blinking light means caution, and a blue flashing light tells you the police are ahead. There's another flashing signal to tell you the weather's changing. Now, this information, it will be served to the helmet by an app, which requires internet connection, rather like a system like Waze would give you real-time traffic alerts, presumably. How the information will be gathered is not quite clear. Functions of the system can be controlled on the move by the handlebars, or they say the tank, although I'm not quite sure how that would work. The in-helmet battery is good for 8 hours. The helmet will also provide the usual Bluetooth links to the phone or media player with mic and speakers. Again, less essential. I really don't think this is necessary, but hey ho. A full HD Sony camera is incorporated into the chin piece, and that can record 2.5 hours of continuous footage before you flatten your 8-hour battery, unless you plug in to the bike or a power bank. How much is all this going to set you back? Well, the price is quoted as $12.99 Australian dollars. And Boyardis claims that the helmet offers more than standard protection, although how he knows that, I don't know. And he also says that this is actually a ballpark price bracket for a high-quality carbon fiber helmet. Yes, okay, fair enough. Of course, none of it matters if it doesn't fit your head. And that's one of the problems with these sort of startups, is that they cannot provide a range of helmet shells and shapes. If you look at your bog standard manufacturers, you can often pull one of their range out that fits, even if one of the others doesn't. All right, okay, so we've run on a little bit longer today than normal, but don't worry about that. It's it for today. Don't forget you can tune in on Saturdays and Wednesdays at 11. In the next show, I'll be looking at the Competition and Markets Authority, who are investigating the merger between insurance giants Aldona, who operate the Carroll Nash and Swinton brand, and Bennett's. And I'll be looking at the implications that could have for a negative price on insurance for riders. So don't forget, if you've missed the show here, you can catch up later on Facebook, over on my Survival Skills UK YouTube channel, or even on my coffee page, where you can also become a supporter and you can access lots of better riding articles over there. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time out. Bye for now.